He was the man who united the world through fear. To his enemies, he was not a conqueror, but a storm. And for the women of those enemies, he was something far worse. When the horsemen of Genghis Khan descended upon a city, the sky itself seemed to darken. Dust rose from the hooves of 1,000 riders, swallowing the sun, and by nightfall, only fire remained. Villages that had stood for centuries vanished in a single day, their names erased, their people scattered like ashes across the wind. To defy him was to invite extinction. To resist was to die without a grave. The Mongols did not merely conquer lands, they conquered existence. Every campaign was a message written in blood. No walls could save you, no prayers could shield you, and no mercy would be found. From the deserts of Khwarezm to the temples of China, his shadow spread, vast, unending, and merciless. Beneath it, kings were broken, empires crumbled, and families were torn apart forever. But the men who perished on the battlefield were the fortunate ones. The real terror began after the fighting stopped, when silence fell and the cries of the defeated rose. Behind every triumph of the great Khan lay the suffering of those who could not fight back, the mothers, daughters, and wives of the fallen. To Genghis, they were not victims, but symbols of victory, living trophies of his supremacy over the world. In the chronicles of his glory, their names were never written. Yet their pain was the price of his empire. Their tears, the ink with which history recorded his greatness. And as his armies galloped ever farther, from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Europe, the wind carried not only his legend, but the whispers of those who would never speak again. This is the untold story of what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies, a story carved not in stone, but in screams. He was born into chaos, not as a prince, but as a hunted child. Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, grew up in a world of betrayal and hunger. His father was poisoned by rivals, his tribe abandoned him and his mother to die in the wilderness. They survived by scavenging roots, hiding from wolves, and learning a lesson the world would never forget. Mercy was a luxury of the weak. From that desolation rose a man who swore to never be powerless again. He united the scattered Mongol clans not with promises of peace, but with fire and fear. Loyalty was demanded, not asked for. Those who defied him were slaughtered. Those who followed him were rewarded with the spoils of conquest. Step by step, through blood and vengeance, Temujin transformed from a desperate nomad into Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Once the steppes bowed to him, his eyes turned outward. He saw the rich kingdoms beyond the grasslands, cities filled with gold, silks, and arrogance. To him they were challenges, to his armies they were prey, and thus began the campaigns that would reshape the known world. His doctrine was simple: if you resist, none shall live. These were not empty words. When the mighty Khwarezm Empire insulted his envoys and executed his merchants, Genghis unleashed a fury unlike anything history had seen. His armies crossed deserts that no sane man would attempt, guided by vengeance and iron discipline. They surrounded the Khwarezmian cities one by one, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, and burned them to dust. In Urgench, every street became a river of blood. Soldiers slaughtered men, then the elderly, then children. The women were gathered, their fates decided not by mercy, but by hierarchy. Some were claimed by generals as spoils of war. Others were forced into servitude: cooks, carriers, concubines. Many were executed to prevent rebellion, their screams drowned out by the crackling of burning homes. In Nishapur, when a Mongol commander was killed in battle, Genghis's forces were ordered to exact vengeance so complete that the city ceased to exist. Every living being, man, woman, and child, was massacred. Chroniclers later wrote that mountains of skulls were built outside the city walls, silent monuments to obedience and terror. For Genghis Khan, war was not only conquest, it was a tool of control. He understood that fear could do what swords could not. His campaigns were designed to annihilate resistance before it began. Rumors of his cruelty traveled faster than his horsemen. Tales of entire cities erased, of rivers clogged with corpses, of women taken and never seen again. When new cities heard the Mongols were coming, many surrendered without a fight, hoping to be spared. But even surrender could not guarantee mercy. He believed that destruction purified the world. To him, civilization itself was weakness, soft, divided, corrupt. The Mongol army, lean and ruthless, was his instrument of divine punishment. Under his rule, death became a message: resist and you will vanish, submit and you will serve. The women and children of the defeated were the unspoken spoils of this doctrine. They were not merely victims, they were resources. Genghis saw them as tools for his empire's future, symbols of dominance, labor for his camps, and sometimes vessels for his bloodline. Beautiful women of noble birth were reserved for his officers or sent to his growing harem. Others were distributed among his warriors, rewards for loyalty and courage, Yet even these rewards were forms of terror. The women were forced to become mothers of their enemies' children, their identities erased, their past lives dissolved into the Mongol tide. They carried the legacy of their conquerors in their wombs, reminders that even their blood no longer belonged to them. In this way, Genghis conquered not just lands, but generations. To his followers, this was divine justice. They believed the eternal blue sky had chosen Genghis to rule all beneath heaven. His victories were proof of divine favor, and the suffering he inflicted was seen as the natural order, the weak devoured by the strong. But to those who survived his wrath, he was not heaven's chosen. He was the end of the world. Cities burned not just because of war, but because of his design. Terror was strategy, obedience was survival, and mercy was extinction. By the time the flames died, an empire had begun, one forged in blood, ash, and silence. Across the steppes, Mongol standards fluttered in the wind over fields of bones. The world had learned the meaning of fear, and the name Genghis Khan had become a curse whispered by survivors in the ruins of their homes. But the worst was yet to come. For the men who had died defending their lands, the suffering was over. For their wives and daughters, the nightmare had only begun. When the fires of conquest died down and the smoke drifted away, the silence that followed was never peace. It was the sound of judgment. For the Mongols, war did not end when the city fell. What followed was the sorting, a ritual of division that decided who would live, who would serve, and who would vanish. Genghis Khan had built an empire that thrived on discipline and order. Every conquest followed the same grim pattern. Once a city's gates were broken, Mongol officers assembled the captives in open squares or along riverbanks. There, under the watchful eyes of the conquerors, the people were divided into categories. Warriors and nobles, the men who might one day rise against the Khan, were executed without hesitation. The elderly were often discarded, the infirm left to die. Artisans and scholars were spared, for their skills had value. Blacksmiths, weavers, and engineers were sent east to serve the empire that had devoured their homes. Then came the women. They were separated from the dead and lined up, the young, the beautiful, the noble, their fates determined not by mercy but by rank. The wives and daughters of princes were brought before Mongol commanders as trophies. Their presence was not for pleasure alone, but to display absolute victory. Taking an enemy's wife was to take his power, to erase his legacy, to claim that even his blood now served another master. In the chronicles written decades later, these women are nameless. But their stories are etched between the lines of history, glimpses of agony in the margins of conquest. When the Khwarezmian Empire fell, Queen Turkan Khatun, once among the most powerful women in Central Asia, found herself hunted. Her armies shattered, her palaces looted. She fled across the deserts carrying what remained of her court. The Mongols captured her near the Caspian Sea. For a queen who had commanded armies and ruled in her own right, her humiliation was deliberate. Stripped of her symbols of authority, paraded before the conquerors, she was reduced to a warning for all who would defy the Khan. Genghis's vengeance against Khwarezm was not only political, it was personal. His envoys had been executed by Turkan Khatun's orders, and now her downfall became his message. Chroniclers say she was treated as property, her attendants scattered, her titles mocked in front of the men who once bowed to her. No blade could wound her more deeply than the loss of her dignity. To the Mongols, this cruelty was not random, it was doctrine. Genghis believed terror was a weapon sharper than any sword. The taking of women, especially noble women, served to break the will of nations. When royal wives were enslaved, when princesses were forced into Mongol tents, their people understood that their bloodlines had been conquered too. Among the most haunting of these tales is that of the Tangut princess. When the Western Xia kingdom refused to aid Genghis in his final campaigns, he sent his armies to annihilate them. The Tangut king surrendered, offering his daughter in marriage to appease the Khan. She became his wife, a symbol of submission, a bridge between conqueror and conquered. But when her people later rose in rebellion, Genghis ordered the complete destruction of her homeland. And when the news reached him, he turned his wrath upon her. The chronicles say she was executed, a silent scapegoat for the sins of her people. Her death marked not justice, but the empire's cold logic. Loyalty to Genghis was absolute, even in love. For the countless women of common birth, there were no titles to protect them, no histories to preserve their suffering. They were divided among the soldiers, prizes for loyalty, tokens of gratitude. Some were carried thousands of miles away, across the steppes and deserts, never to see their homeland again. Others perished in the forced marches that followed conquest, their bodies left unburied along the roads that the Mongols paved with bones. Those who survived were repurposed. Some became concubines, their bodies turned into instruments of empire. Others became servants, raising the children of their masters, cooking for the same men who had slaughtered their families. A few, the youngest and most beautiful, were sent to the Khan's own court. Genghis kept a vast retinue of wives and concubines, many of them taken from the nobility of defeated kingdoms. Within his gold-plated tents, they lived in silence, their former lives erased, their new identities bound to the whims of empire. To Genghis, women were not only symbols of domination, but tools of legacy. By fathering children with the daughters of conquered rulers, he claimed the right to their thrones, weaving foreign bloodlines into his own. It was conquest by another name, not through the sword, but through the womb. His sons and grandsons inherited this policy, spreading Mongol blood from the Volga to the Pacific. Even today, genetic studies suggest that nearly 1 in 200 men on Earth carry his lineage, a legacy born as much from violence as from empire. Rape, in the world of Genghis Khan, was not an act of lust. It was strategy. It erased identity, extinguished resistance, and redefined inheritance. By violating the women of his enemies, he ensured their sons would no longer bear the names of kings, but of slaves. It was domination reduced to its most brutal simplicity, the conqueror rewriting the human body itself as a testament to power. And yet, within this machinery of terror, traces of humanity flickered. Some of the captive women learned to navigate the empire's brutal hierarchy. A few gained influence through cunning, survival, and patience. They whispered into the ears of generals, protected children born of violence, and softened the edges of tyranny where they could. But even their strength could not disguise the truth, that the Mongol world was built upon their silence. Outside Genghis's grand tent, where silk banners swayed and the air smelled of blood and incense, there was always quiet. That quiet was not peace, it was exhaustion, the stillness of those who had nothing left to lose. Inside, the Khan planned his next conquest, unmoved by the grief outside his walls. The cries of the conquered had become the background music of empire. The Mongols believed themselves chosen by the eternal sky, destined to rule all men. But beneath that divine vision lay the suffering of millions of women, stripped of their crowns, their families, and their names. To history, they became invisible. To Genghis, they became proof that no one, not kings, not queens, not empires, could resist his will. And as his horsemen galloped toward new horizons, the pattern repeated again and again. Cities fell, families were broken, women were divided like spoils beneath the stars. And through it all, the great Khan rode on, his heart untouched by the ruin in his wake. For the world, he became a legend, the ruler who united half the earth. For the women who lived and died beneath his shadow, he was something else entirely. Not a man of destiny, but a god of devastation. In the world Genghis Khan built, power did not end with conquest. It was meant to flow through generations, carried in blood. The sword could win an empire, but only lineage could preserve it. From the moment he rose from the ashes of exile, Genghis understood that dominion was not only about land or armies, it was about bloodlines, the invisible empire that outlasted death itself. To him, the body was a battlefield, and the womb was a weapon. Every woman taken, every child born of conquest, was a victory that could not be undone. His armies could burn cities to the ground, but his legacy would grow within the bodies of the conquered, generation after generation. Even when stone monuments crumbled and nations vanished, his blood would survive, silent, unstoppable, immortal. Centuries later, modern science uncovered a truth that confirmed the reach of that vision. Genetic studies revealed that nearly 16 million men across Asia, from the steppes of Mongolia to the valleys of Pakistan, carry a Y chromosome traceable to a single ancestor who lived around 800 years ago. The conclusion was as inevitable as it was chilling. The blood of Genghis Khan still runs through the veins of millions. His empire of violence had become an empire of flesh, but this inheritance was not born of love. It was forged through terror. Genghis treated marriage as an extension of war, a political instrument sharpened by desire and control. He took wives not out of affection, but to seal dominance. Every union was a declaration of victory, every birth a symbol of his divine right to rule. When he accepted the daughters of defeated rulers, it was not to share his throne. It was to erase theirs. Their children, bearing his blood, ensured that no rival lineage could ever reclaim its power. He gifted women the same way he gifted lands or gold, as tokens of loyalty. To his generals, loyal warriors who had ridden with him through deserts and death, he rewarded wives taken from conquered nations. Some were princesses, others were the widows of slain kings. Each gift carried meaning, a reminder that every man in his empire owed his fortune to the Khan's will. These marriages were the glue of his dominion, alliances bound not by treaties, but by blood. His sons learned this lesson well. Joshi, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui each extended his father's methods, building what historians would later call an empire of blood. They spread his seed and his laws across continents, mixing Mongol blood with Persian, Chinese, Turkic, and Russian. The result was a dynasty unlike any the world had seen, one not confined to borders, but woven through humanity itself. And yet, behind this vast network of lineage stood the women, unnamed, unseen, unremembered. To Genghis, they were vessels of continuity. To the empire, they were tools of assimilation. The act of birth, sacred in most civilizations, became under Mongol rule a continuation of conquest. Each child was both legacy and reminder, carrying within them the memory of destruction. The Mongol chroniclers spoke of Genghis's vision as divine order, the eternal blue sky's will made flesh. They wrote of his strength, his wisdom, his destiny. But they did not write of the women who carried that destiny in silence. They did not describe the fear of a concubine brought into his tent, the cold realization that her body was no longer her own. They did not record the tears of a princess who watched her family's killers celebrate her wedding night. In their silence, the chronicles tell another story, one written in absence in what they chose not to say. For every triumph they celebrated, there were countless voices erased, countless lives reduced to genealogy. The empire's expansion was not just drawn on maps. It was inscribed in flesh, spreading like veins across continents, invisible yet eternal. Genghis believed that to control the future, one must control the womb. His vision was not only to conquer lands, but to breed empires. He once declared that the greatest joy of life was to crush your enemies, to drive them before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. But his cruelty was not chaos, it was policy. By turning the conquered into mothers of Mongol heirs, he made rebellion biologically impossible. The blood of the enemy became his own. This was the philosophy that outlived him. When he died in 1227, the empire did not fall. it multiplied. His descendants ruled from China to Persia, from Russia to the Middle East. Each Khan, each prince, carried a piece of his body and a fragment of his will. Some became cultured monarchs, others ruthless warlords, but all traced their power to the same unholy source, the fusion of love and violence, life and domination. To Genghis, historians would later write, blood was empire. It was his currency, his signature, his immortality. He believed the world itself could be rewritten through it. That human identity was clay, to be molded by the strong and passed down as inheritance. But to his wives and concubines, blood meant something else entirely. It was not glory, but grief. Each drop carried the memory of a burned home, a dead father, a forgotten name. The same blood that made him eternal turned them into ghosts. Centuries later, his name is still spoken with awe, the conqueror who built the largest land empire in history, the man whose genes stretch across half the world. But his truest monument is not the empire he built, nor the legends carved in stone. It is the silent, invisible web of blood that binds millions of descendants to a legacy born in terror. Empires die, nations fade, but blood remembers. And somewhere, deep within that memory, the women of the past still whisper, not of conquest, but of loss. They were the architects of his eternity, unwilling mothers of an empire that began with fire and ended in silence. Their story is not written in the annals of history, but in the veins of the living, proof that even the smallest act of suffering can echo across time. For the world, Genghis Khan's blood is a symbol of endurance. For the women who carried it, it was the price of survival. In a world built on ruin, survival itself became an act of defiance. Beneath the endless shadow of conquest, where cities burned and bloodlines vanished, there existed another story, quieter, but no less powerful. It was the story of the women who lived, the ones who endured when endurance seemed impossible, the ones who found a way to breathe, to adapt, and to shape destiny from the ashes of destruction. Even in the empire of fear, strength did not belong to men alone. Among those women was one whose presence would alter the course of history, Berta, the first and most trusted wife of Genghis Khan. Long before the world knew his name, before he became the terror of empires, Berta was the one who stood beside him when he was nothing. She came from a noble family of the Kongerad tribe and was betrothed to Temujin when they were still children. In a time when alliances were sealed by marriage, Berta's union with Temujin was more than a bond of affection. It was a fragile lifeline for a boy cast into exile. But fate tested her early. Soon after their marriage, Berta was kidnapped by a rival tribe, the Merkit. For months she was held captive, and when Temujin finally rescued her, she returned carrying another man's child. It was a wound that would have broken many marriages. Yet Temujin accepted her back, raising the boy, Yochi, as his own. Historians have long debated whether Genghis truly believed Jochi was his blood, but what mattered was not belief, but loyalty. Berta's abduction, humiliation, and endurance marked him forever. It taught him that mercy could be fatal, that vengeance was survival. The empire he later built, one that erased its enemies without hesitation, was born in part from the memory of her suffering. Though the chronicles describe Berta in passing, her influence can be felt in the spaces between Genghis's wars. She managed his household, mediated disputes, and often advised him on matters of clan and loyalty. While the world saw her as the Khan's wife, she was in truth his counterpart, the silent architect of stability in a life defined by bloodshed. When he rode to war, Berta ruled the camps. She ensured discipline, order, and the care of the families who followed the Mongol armies across the steppes. Through her, the women of the empire found a semblance of power, not by wielding swords, but by mastering survival. Beyond the tents of the Khans, thousands of women lived other forms of endurance. Some, taken as captives from conquered lands, rose through cunning and intelligence. The Mongol court, for all its cruelty, was not blind to competence. Women who proved resourceful could gain authority, managing supplies, overseeing trade, or even influencing diplomacy. In an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian, information was as precious as steel. Women who could listen, calculate, and speak wisely found ways to matter. There were slave women who became indispensable, entrusted with the secrets of generals or the upbringing of princes. There were mothers who shielded their children by learning the language of their captors, blending into the empire that had destroyed their homes. Their names have been lost, their stories reduced to whispers, but their endurance built the quiet foundations of Mongol rule. For every conquest that history remembers, there were thousands of unseen acts of survival, small, desperate, and sacred. Some of these women passed down their memories through stories, tales that outlived the empire itself. In the nomadic camps that stretched across the steppe, old women would sit by the fire and tell of how they had seen the world burn, how they had served kings and killers alike, and how they had lived to see both dust and peace. These stories did not glorify the conqueror. They remembered the human cost, the hunger, the fear, the longing for lost faces. In them, the women were not victims or heroes, but witnesses. Even in the darkest corners of the Mongol world, life persisted. There were births and songs, laughter and stolen moments, and the stubborn will to keep existing. Captive mothers taught their daughters the art of silence, how to survive the gaze of a conqueror, how to hide pain behind obedience, how to wait until the storm passed. It was a form of resistance the Mongols could never destroy, endurance as rebellion. Some of these women shaped the future in unexpected ways. Through marriages, through their children, they connected cultures that had once been enemies. A Chinese concubine might raise a Mongol prince who later ruled Persia. A Persian servant might teach her captors new songs or words that lived on in language long after empires died. In this strange alchemy of suffering and adaptation, they became the invisible hands that wove East and West together. And yet, even in their resilience, sorrow remained their inheritance. Many of these women lived lives half in shadow, half in silence, never truly belonging to the worlds they bridged. Their strength was born from necessity, not choice. Their courage was not celebrated in chronicles or monuments, but it endured in their descendants, in the traders, scholars, and nomads who later carried Mongol blood across continents. Perhaps the most haunting truth of all is that Burta, the woman who survived abduction and gave birth to an empire, ended her life in solitude. As Genghis continued his conquests, she remained in Mongolia, governing the heartland while he pursued eternal war. When he died, his sons inherited the world, but Burta inherited only memory. She had given him everything: loyalty, forgiveness, lineage, and received in return the immortality of silence. Her story, like that of so many women of her age, was written not in words, but in what the world chose to forget. And yet, her strength outlasted the flames of conquest. The empire Genghis built may have been carved by men, but it was sustained by women, by their endurance, their labor, their quiet understanding of pain. Every tent raised, every army fed, every alliance born through marriage bore their unseen fingerprints. They were the breath that kept the empire alive while history looked elsewhere. When the Mongol world finally began to crumble, centuries after Genghis's death, the memory of those women lingered. In folk songs, in desert poems, in the nameless lullabies of nomads, echoes of their endurance remained. They were remembered not as victims, but as the ones who endured the storm and outlived it. In the vast silence of the steppe, when the wind moves through the grass and the stars stretch endlessly above, one can almost imagine them, the survivors, walking across the barren plains, carrying their stories within them like fading embers. Some were queens, some slaves, some forgotten mothers. All were witnesses. Each life a candle in the darkness, each flame a stolen life that refused to die. For in the empire of Genghis Khan, power belonged to men, but survival belonged to women. History remembers the roar, not the silence. It remembers the thundering hooves, the burning cities, the banners of conquest unfurling beneath endless skies. It remembers Genghis Khan as the unstoppable force, the son of heaven, the man who bent the world to his will. But history, written by victors, seldom remembers the whispers. The ones left behind, the women, the children, the conquered, vanish into silence. Their tears were not recorded, their names were not carved into stone, and yet, without their suffering, there would be no empire to remember at all. Every legend of greatness is built on invisible bones. Every triumph hides the echo of a cry. We call Genghis Khan a genius of war, a visionary who united tribes and reshaped continents. But what is genius if it thrives on devastation? Was his empire born of brilliance, or of the agony of millions who had no choice but to kneel? For every city that rose under his banner, 100 more turned to ash. For every oath of loyalty, there was a voice silenced forever. And yet, the world glorifies him still. Statues gleam where skulls once stood. His name evokes awe, not mourning. It is the oldest pattern of civilization, to worship power, even when it comes wrapped in ruin. We measure history by the conqueror's reach, not by the depth of the graves he left behind. But silence does not die. It lingers, in the wind that sweeps across the Mongolian plains, in the sands that hide broken jewelry, in the faint songs that survived where empires did not. They called him the Son of Heaven. But for the women he conquered, he was the end of the world. Empires rise on the bones of the forgotten, and their whispers still ride the wind of the steppe.